over supply chains. We fully support, additionally, efforts by the EU to research and produce sustainable technologies like farming techniques and sharing it with the rest of the world. We are also okay if individual countries or regional blocs make regulations like this for their own countries as well. What we are not okay with and what we oppose in this debate is the EU unilaterally imposing this regulation on companies that is outside its jurisdiction and punishing companies outside that have very different supply chain backgrounds. So the most likely counterfactual we are going to see in the debate is that there's going to be sentiments and this political capital that was used to pass this policy that recognizes the reality that deforestation is damaging for the planet. And this is likely to be translated into other efforts. Crucially, what we're hoping for in opposition is support in the form of research, technology, expertise, and training from the EU to be spread out to the developing world, because this is what they need to achieve the just transition. That is why the EU shouldn't do this. I flagged this in your POI. Why not? It's a terrible answer. Before I go into the arguments, I just want to give you a couple of pieces of context about the status quo right now. The first is that we already see a greater awareness of the necessity to transition. We see energy companies like Shell and ExxonMobil. These are huge oil companies, by the way, that have made profit lobbying states against climate change regulation. They are also the biggest funders of solar and wind farms. And the reason why they're doing this is because they recognize that fossil fuels as a business model is untenable in the long term. All of our research suggests that our fossil fuel reserves are going to run out by 2050, and existing efforts to continue finding new sources of oil is getting increasingly costlier, increasingly riskier. That's why they're transitioning to green technology. Consumers are also increasingly climate conscious. This is reflected in the greener products that's being produced right now, the demand for things like sustainable tourism, the reduction of single-use plastic, cleaner fashion, and the opposition to fast fashion and stuff like that. And because the greater or the generation in the market reflecting this trend, companies are also following suit as well. Lastly, on governance, if it is true that harm to the environment affects the people as well, governments will also have the incentive to respond the same way they are responding right now already, pushing for sustainable practices, including further regulations on deforestation, especially on illegal logging in places like Southeast Asia. And we are okay if governments push for these regulations themselves. No, thank you, but it must be done on their own terms. We oppose the EU unilaterally forcing it on everyone. To that extent, a lot of the outcomes as to how we protect the environment will be symmetric on both sides. We're happy to accept maybe a bit more deforestation happens in opposition goals as well, but it's a necessary part of economic development and a just transition to a better society. Two arguments. First, why this imposition is unjust. It is very simple. Though there is no representation, the EU controls EU markets. They do not control the supply chains of companies worldwide. So all the countries inside the EU that can have a voice within the European Parliament have a say in this specific regulation being passed, and they all can voice out concerns about the way this regulation is implemented. Other countries around the world who are not part of this process have no say in the way this regulation is created, and therefore no say in the way this regulation impacts them, even though it does affect them. So the productivity of land might depend on many different factors. You have companies like Monsanto that have land in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, in Costa Rica, etc. But because productivity of land depends on the weather, the labor cost, random chance. All these things are outside of the EU's control, and therefore it is unfair for the EU to make impositions on companies that they have no control over. And companies, put your POIs in the chat, please. Things that they don't have any control over, and then then deny them access to a significant market, which is the EU. We think this is a form of neo-colonialism, and we think that the same way the government of your country should not make laws to which you do not have representation or do not have any recourse. The legitimacy of these laws derive from the consent of the governed, and in this case, supply chains who are not part of this do not consent to be governed in this way. Therefore, this law is illegitimate. This principle wins us the debate immediately because it shows that the way this is being constructed is unjust, and unless the Gulf can draw the link between these other companies and the EU markets, I don't think they can I think this is just enough for us to win. The second argument I want to discuss in terms of practical aspects, why this imposition is very harmful to companies in the developing world. Why many agricultural companies around the world just don't have the capacity to shift right now. Because the resources required is a lot more than just time. It is technology, it is funding, it is expertise, it is training, it is information, sustainable farming techniques, organic fertilizer. If you think that chemical fertilizer causes things like eutrophication, you need to train these farmers how to farm sustainably and make sure they don't overwork the land. You need to buy land to plant. In many cases, farmers don't have awareness because they often live on the outskirts of the country, and the government information programs are not that great. How will farmers in Costa Rica get new land to plant cocoa if they want to increase their cocoa production, if the state wants to do that, and they don't have access to land? The EU is not providing any of this support. The same way the EU didn't provide any support for the requirements for ESG disclosures, governments had to scramble to put together training materials and teach companies and SMEs how to disclose their ESG requirements so that they could continue trading with the EU. The EU doesn't provide any of this support at all. So we think this is very unlikely to happen and it's going to be very problematic. The second thing we'll point out is that many different contexts as well. So even in cases where some of these companies could shift, developing countries sometimes need to clear forests in order to develop through things like agriculture or manufacturing. This is a decision that governments need to make for themselves, representing the best interests of their constituencies. So in places like Latin America, where they support things like cotton and coffee planting, they have systems like rotating farmlands to balance the nutrients in the soil. In Indonesia, where you regularly have slash and burns, farmers let the farmlands grow over with shrubbery before they chop it down for the next season. So they kind of have this rotating system there where you plant here and then you let things grow back. And then you clear other forests and you come back again later, which is something that is in itself sustainable, but it's not something that the EU captures here. But even if none of this is true, even if companies had capacity to transition, I'm not sure why it is fair for the EU to force them to do so. What if companies have different priorities, like internal training or research and development? This move forces companies to make decisions that can often be detrimental towards their own long-term growth. And again, because they didn't have any ability to influence the decision, when policies affect them in a negative way, there's no choice for them to either comply or to face sanctions. How do you weigh this? One, imposition is unjust. It's a form of neocolonialism where the first world uses financial coercion to bully the third world. Second, this is extremely harmful for nations who don't have the capacity to adjust. You are punishing companies who cannot comply with this policy that lose out on market share. But number three, this reinforces existing inequities, which is long-term harm to the market because companies who can transition tend to be richer, tend to be more powerful, so they then dominate the market and reinforce existing inequities. For all of those reasons, this is a great idea, but horrible in practice. Very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you, Elo, for that speech. DPM.
Am I audible and visible?
Yep, you are.
Appears on the chat. Starting my speech. Just a sec. All right. Yeah, just starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Companies normally don't have the capacity to transition. This will hamper their long-term sustainability. ExxonMobil is trying to shift because there's an inevitability of you having scarce resources, which is why the companies would necessarily have to shift in the longer run. What are the dual premises going to prove in this debate for the opening opposition? We think the only impact that they're trying to highlight is that, oh, this is not sustainable. If we just prove to you that this policy will have more buy-in, we win this debate from opening opposition. They would like you to believe this policy is not sustainable, hence there's a less likelihood of this having any sort of efficacy or buy-in. First, the fiat of the motion suggests that we have some sort of efficacy. That is to say, our policy will be successful even if it is 10%, it is going to be successful. That's the fiat for the motion. The second thing that I want to say here is think about it. Consumer protection is important. So consumers want to facilitate their choices by going sustainable in the future. People are becoming vogue and more vogue and vogue, and they would like to facilitate their choices. Companies would like to protect consumer choices. There's majority of the people who would still think that climate change is a big issue. There's the buy-in that you're going to have once these companies start to transition into sustainable programs. We think there's going to be mobilization because this is one step for the political mobilization and economic mobilization towards countries and companies having sustainable system for climate change. ACE's analysis never really contended with what better policies or alternatives that they have to begin with. The third thing I want you to note within this buy-in is that there's going to be more accountability. Since an overarching body of the European Union is mandating this, we think this is going to have some sort of accountability that is just bigger than an individual going to a court. In the absence of this policy, one environmentalist goes to the court and is unable to have any accountability based on the kind of resources that they have, versus you having European Union on your side. The third thing that I want you to note, this is just for clarification of this motion, is that the info slide says European Union announced plans to adopt the EUDR. That is to say, that is going to be mandated within the European Union, and any company that is working with the European Union would have to, make amends to the way that they were working before. This is not mandating every company outside the European Union which is not doing trade with the European Union. I would say that companies would never stop giving out commodities to the European Union for two reasons. One is a market of 26 countries. That is to say, it's a large market to tap into, a lot of population, especially cocoa, right? Because Europeans love coffee, right? That's my intuition pump. But Saudi Arabia and all these countries that produce cocoa would necessarily like to have European Union as their client because of the kind of consumption of cocoa that they do within it, right? We think this is going to be very effective in terms of efficacy. That being dealt, we don't necessarily think, and this is the last thing in the refutation that I wanted to make, is that they would like you to think that this is an imposition of the policy on companies. This is just like protectionist policies that countries normally have. This is just a logical extension of protecting the interest of the world by protecting it from climate change, but also themselves, so they don't get flooded in the next coming years. We don't necessarily think this is something that they're doing on their own. What are going to be my extensions then? Two things. One, we think this protects the indigenous rights within the European Union. So there are indigenous communities living in the European Union. The reason why this is good. What is the framing for this extension? There are two intuition pumps that I want to make. One, these are events that have happened. These are treaties that have been signed for the protection of the indigenous land and indigenous people's rights. There are two treaties that have been signed. One, the Global Public Goods and Challenges. Second, support for civil society organization and local authorities. The European Union has already done that for the protection of the land that belongs to indigenous community. Plantation and forestation has been taken away from these people. We don't think that is something that is absolutely necessary, and this time for them to be reported, right? We think this also helps to encourage and protect the rights of indigenous people of their lands and resources. Why is it important? Because it protects them with their own interests and also social justice. The second thing that I want to note here in terms of extension is the idea of supply chain transparency. What does that mean? That means that once you have this policy in place, it mandates companies to prove that their products do not contribute to deforestation. That is transparency within the supply chain, right? Why is it important? It is important because it encourages companies to adopt sustainable practices. Why is it necessary? Two things then. One, it eradicates monopoly, something that Asa talked to you about. I'm going to give you further analysis, which is that it provides a level playing field for businesses that already prioritize sustainability. That is to say, some companies have already been existent and have had advantages, certain unfair advantages of being in the market before people who advocated for sustainable practices came into being. This also prevents companies from engaging or from gaining unfair competitive advantage that they've had before in the past. So this eradicates monopolies. The second impact of this is it is also about consumer protection, something that I've already dealt with in terms of refutation, which is about facilitating consumer choice, and there's going to be buy-in for climate change and mobilization of political funds and whatnot. Why is the ASA speech then becoming very, very important? Because it hasn't been dealt with. Second, the idea is that ASA talks about so many things that are literally just not engaged with. So at max, opening opposition's case is a parallel case that they're trying to run. There's no engagement whatsoever. Why is ASA's case important then? Because he tells you three things. One, he says that this is the only cheaper alternative that you have against climate change. The race is it's a steady race, and you have to make certain policies that are necessary for you to prevent climate change. There is no alternative or any other mechanisms from that. Second, he also tells you about the monopolies in the developing states, something that is never really engaged with. The fact that developing states have already and always been exploited by the developing state, and that needs to end by having sustainable practices. And the only way that you can do that is by encouraging them, but also having some sort of indirect imposition that you can only trade with the European Union if you have these policies enacted. You can also, outsource these funding, etc., etc. Something Asia talked about, again, never really refuted. Third, he also said that even if the profits are being hampered, you can always reinvest through taxes and fines. We think this chunk of case was very important that was never really engaged with. For all of these reasons, very proud to propose.
All right, thank you, DPM, for that speech, Diallo.
Hi, can I check if I'm audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. OG is not comparative in this debate. We did not say that it was not sustainable. We said it was unjust for the EU to impose this on other countries. The reason we didn't have to do it with OG, according to their claims, was that we agree with everything they say. We agree with protecting the environment. We agree with all the harms of time-sensitive problems. The problem is one of imposition on other countries and one of sovereignty. What did we tell you from OO? We said consumers are necessarily climate conscious, and in the status quo, there is a trend towards being green. There is things like rejecting fast fashion. People are less likely to use plastic bags and straws. They pack their own food in food containers. Governments have incentives to respond positively if harming the environment hurts their country. What is the bottom line of this? We said that countries often have investments in alternative energy sources, or maybe they don't. Maybe they want to focus on upskilling or whatnot. At the point in which you attack the core of their economy, you harm their ability to invest long-term in R&D for other alternative energy sources. That was the comparative in this debate. I'm going to talk about two broad questions in my speech. One, I'm going to talk about regulation from the top, why EU traditionally is not the best actor. Secondly, I'm going to talk about people on the ground, something I think OG conveniently forgets to talk about. Let's start with one, regulation from the top and why EU is not the best actor. I don't think they deal with this right from LO, but I'm going to add to this, which is that EU countries have historically been pollutive since the age of industrialization. At the point in which these machines took off and they started emitting more greenhouse gases, when the EU started producing more and more products, the net effect of this was that they released a lot of greenhouse gases. A lot of the environmental harms that we see today were traditionally due from them. That is to say, it is very much a case of double standards at the point in which they were able to leverage polluting the environment to get to the level they are, and now to flip it around and attack countries like us. No, thank you. Number two, let's talk about neo-colonialism, which is TJ's argument, again, severely under-responded to. We said this was a form of imposition. Why is this so? When Malaysia and Indonesia launched a complaint to the WTO, they also alleged that the EU was trying to cut down on palm oil because they wanted to boost the economy for their own alternative, which is rapeseed, right? But rapeseed is also problematic. It involves high amounts of nitrogen fertilizer, which means emitting more greenhouse gases. Also, on the net, palm oil gives you more oil compared to rapeseed. The argument for Malaysia and Indonesia, which we'll take in this debate, is that it's a form of protecting the local economy at the cost of free trade. We think that's a problem. Let's also talk about the RSPO, which currently exists in status quo. No, thank you. We'd argue that it's not very good, right? Even the supply chains that they verified have violations, enforcement is weak, there's little retribution for non-compliance. The fact is, and this is the third level, that these people need training, support, and financial incentives to transition towards greener policies. Gov doesn't provide that, right? The RSPO, even as flawed as it is, has the RSPO Smallholder Support Fund, right? This looks like so we largely support the EU creating more green tech and making it accessible, but we're not okay with them imposing a timeline and telling us what to do. Why is this so? The first thing is, obviously it takes a lot of time to reclaim land so we can extract palm oil on it. Like, you need time to grow the trees to build sustainable palm oil. Like, it takes 2 to 4 years to build you know, to build out these plantations. Even sustainable beef, for example, you need to grow the damn cow, guys. It doesn't just come from nowhere. You need to control what you feed it. All of these things need time. So it's not enough for them to say we give them some amount of time, like maybe 1 year. It's not enough, guys. But the more pernicious thing is that a lot of the people in these countries are smallholders. That is to say, people who live near the fields, people who make a living from these jobs. So I want to rebut this OG characterization which says it's all dominated by NNCs. Yes, Nestle and Mondelez do sell a lot of products with palm oil, but the main benefiters from this are the people on the ground who derive jobs, especially in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, where 85% of the jobs 85% of the palm oil economy is from there. A lot of the lower income population derive income from this. The comparative is you need time for education and upskilling. These people will be literally out of a job. Few months or 1 year is not going to cut it. Let's talk about the second argument about why people on the ground will be left behind. Yeah, before that I'll take you.
Considering you have a principal problem against any climate initiative EU takes because they polluted environment in the past, are you also against COP27, Paris Agreement, and 100 other climate initiatives by the UN because they also consist of Western countries that polluted environment in the past?
Yeah, no, but this doesn't deal with TJ's argument. We told you that the EU can impose policies in the EU where everybody has a say. You cannot impose one that disproportionately harms Malaysia and Indonesia, who make up 85% of the world's palm oil economy. Like, it's not proportionate, it's not just. I think it's a very, you know, intuitive argument.
POI?
I just took you. Next. So what is the problem with targeting people on the ground, right? Let's characterize that smallholders produce 95% of Vietnam's coffee, 42% of Indonesia's palm oil, and 95% of Thailand's rubber, right? The problem is when you impose these policies, the bottom line is the first to go. That looks like necessarily these people living near these places running out of jobs. 2, this also looks like producers and traders having to provide precise geographical coordinates and ESG reports for all plots of land from which it was sourced. Given that, you know, you need to tangle a lot of land rights, who owns the land, and a lot of people go out of jobs, we think that's a problem. We necessarily drive out poverty levels. The last thing I want to make is how extraordinarily complicated it is to tie this to the word sustainable or non-sustainable. It's not that simple. Palm oil has one of the most complicated supply chains of any ingredient, and it's very difficult to make sure that it's sustainable. Like, a single palm oil mill can buy food from a multitude of suppliers with all its formulations and derivatives, like the squeezing of the kernel to get the oil. There's so many variables in this. The fact that supermarkets often source palm oil and a lot of products with palm oil often makes it very difficult for them to trace the precise source of their supply chain and to make sure it's sustainable. What is the bottom line? We said it's very expensive, it's very difficult, and the EU is not in a position to impose on Malaysia and Indonesia. Very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you, DLO, for that speech. Oh, sorry, yeah, member of COP.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. So, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 2 extensions from closing government. Firstly, why farmers or workers in plantation in developing countries are able to leverage more against the EU market so that they are able to get more payment, which is prerequisite for them to having more food on table. Secondarily, why more investment, the concentration of investment and always allow that more sustainable job opportunity, more sustaining plantation or farmers, allow local people to keep having their job, which is necessary for their living. On the first extension, I have 4 burdens to prove. Firstly, on the premise, the developing country has a larger and greater scale of farms, sites, which has been created before 2020 December compared to EU. Here is 2 such reasons.
The main problem with our opposition's case is that they firstly clearly misunderstood the real like purpose of the EU companies, right? Because the EU, right? Because firstly, why would EU just suddenly pass out a motion and suddenly they would want to give more money to those farmers they're actually buying these markets from? Clearly no, right? Because we tell you that there are two purposes why the EU want to have this policy being implemented. Firstly, like they do care about the environment, they want to have more sustainable development, so right, sure, because that's the important stakeholder to be taken into consideration, right? And secondly, maybe they will just be wanting to use this policy to gain more international reputation, so like showing to the international world that they're actually doing something to actually help with this environment. We see perfectly no wrong in that, but we simply don't see why they should be the ones who are actually harming those peoples and those countries from developing countries. In this speech, I'm first going to give to our arguments saying how this will potentially harm developing countries, which we see as a very important stakeholder under this case, as I'll further elaborate. And secondly, we'll tell you guys how this actually means less efficiency and how much more alternatives can actually be raised, which actually can have the real impact of solving the environmental crisis, but it doesn't have to be EU implementing and hurting those countries devastatingly. And then moving on, I'll be giving some rebuttals to our side governments here. But first, our arguments. First, on developing countries, right? Because developed countries may have time and ability to focus on the so-called environmental protection, but there's no policy helping developing countries to actually shift from the so-called first primary sector to secondary sector production, right? But they're simply cutting the most important sector of production, agriculture, which developing countries' companies are heavily relying on, right? Because this is not solving the problem, right? Because this will simply cause more problems other than environment that will raise awareness in the society. The opening government says, sure, we have two solutions. Firstly, they can just shift. However, that is untrue, right? Because under this policy, there's no so-called support policy that actually encourages them to actually shift. The only way they think that they will shift is by pushing them onto so desperate way where they will have no way but to shift to another sector that they may not be good at producing, and they may not have the capacity and actually of doing so, as the opposition side have clearly explained already. And secondly, they told us that you can go and just change a market, right? Firstly, we tell you that no, because as we have already know, if they are already focusing their market on the EU, that means EU is a big market. So heavily dependence on the EU means that it is hard for them to actually go and shift more market. But even if we do accept that their point, say that they will shift to other markets, but then this actually makes them no better under the status quo, because why would this actually make any change if all you have to do is just sell your products to Asia and look at places where the restrictions are low? This is still not actually solving the problem of climate change or the so-called environmental issues, right? Because this will simply result in the fact that deforestation is just being displaced rather than reduced globally. We have two impacts saying why this win is especially important under this scenario. Firstly, we tell you that we win on the short-term prioritized swaying, right? Because they have to convince those citizens what's it to them that the earth will like somehow be drowned out millions of years later and because of climate change, when they cannot even get enough food to eat at the moment, right? Because the EU can get the reputation of protecting the environment and leaves companies and the developing countries to just crash down, because apparently they don't care about long-term development, the so-called like environmental issues to be solved, as when currently they cannot even sustain their own life, and those farmers or those corporations, firms are just being left to get themselves bankruptcy, and they cannot even sustain their living. So that's why we believe, even if they raise a bunch of reasons saying why this is an effective problem to actually solve the case, this is still in itself wrong, because it will just raise more catastrophe in the world, as the short-term issue is something to be taken into great consideration under this topic here, because that are much more severe a problem than compared to their so-called like long-term impacts, right? And secondly, we tell you that at this period of time, those specific groups has a greater prioritization. That means the developing countries are actually the ones who to be prioritized even more, because they're the ones who take a greater percentage of the population, and they're also the ones who are most likely to have a severe damage, because there's no support but only sanctions, because there's no reason telling us that they can shift when there are already no support but only sanctions to their own priorities. So that's why we believe they're the most important important stakeholder, and because of that, those two wins, we've already outweighed saying why this policy in itself is just causing more damage to the society on the whole. And secondly, we tell you about little efficiency, right? Because how do you expect them to simply apply all those tracking and certificating system? Because obviously this will create significant administrative burdens for both the administrators and for those businesses or regulators. For example, they require extensive documents, monitoring, and verification, etc. And also why is this specifically unique when the EU is implementing this problem? Because if we simply leave this to domestic works, then this will not be that so much of documents or markets or market monitoring needed, as you're actually making this problem domestically. However, in EU as an international court, international society need to focus and gather around different countries, meaning that they have a successive more things to do rather than a domestic country, which is the alternative that we have already raising up to you, which we believe that global regulations and or domestic regulations are much more into this hand than simply letting EU a global organization to direct the case. And also, this is especially important because when you're actually trying to solve the problem of climate change, you shouldn't be diverting resources from climate change to other you shouldn't be diverting resources from other important environmental initiatives simply to solve the problem of monitoring and documents, which we have already proven to be ineffective at the first place. Then moving on to some brief rebuttals. The other side keep on saying how this will just lead to somehow more investments and more payments to those farmers, right? Because however, why will that ever be true? Because there will just only be more payments as long as there are little supply. Then that still will be a problem to society, because when there is less supplies, that means the price of the products will raise up, but then it's still the citizens who are actually bearing the risks from the start. And little supply means that there are a lot of people already being driven out of the industries. So what are those citizens, those corporations in developing countries, as we have already proven to you in this speech. So we have proven to you why this rule is in itself ineffective and is wrong for those individuals and for those developing countries to actually suffer. Thus, we're very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you, member of opposition, for that speech. Government Whip.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
All right, thanks. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, we weigh our extension up against the OZ. Two things. Firstly, we proved more tangible impact. It is unclear at the point of OZ to what extent the environment better off that, and to what extent that impairment affect to the people. We clearly mentioned workers in developing country better off. This looks like they can buy food to put on the table, or they can have the accumulative benefits to get some kind of degree of the improvement of their payment. But secondly, I think as for the metric coming from OZ to protect the environment, I think CZ proved to you that we can protect the current land and current land. And protecting current land is more important compared to what OZ said, because this protecting current lands directly connect to the protecting the work of current people. I think in that situation, and also it's connected to increasing wages for the farmer in developing country. I think because these metrics do exist, I think that protecting current land is more prior compared to what OZ said. Then because of these two reasons, I think we already win against OZ. Then moving on to the responses against opposition side. So firstly about CEO. CEO mainly talks about firstly about the burden of each the country, but secondly about why EU cannot EU likely to go short-term issue or something like that. Firstly about the burden, two layers. Firstly about the price of the product. I think these kind of increase in the price of the product is unlikely to occur, because firstly there is regulation from the government, and they have the incentive not to like become like higher prices. It is intuitively understandable those kind of like regulation did happen in order to like mitigate the like increase in the prices. But secondly, like in the very first place, when we can increase the like stock prices, or like higher the stock prices, we can gain the resources. In that situation, I think those kind of like money will go to the agriculture in the developing country. I think that even in that situation, we can increase the wages for those kind of farmer without like increasing the stock price, like increasing the prices of the product. The second things that they talking about, and also like gradual, and also like they are likely these policy will be gradually implemented, which means that it's unlikely to happen. It's unlikely to connect to the market shock, which means that it is less likely that the price of a product will increase. The second things that they talk about the burden is that like it is hard for the monitoring or something like that because of the document or something like that. I think firstly it is unclear to what extent these kind of things is significant. But secondly, I think those kind of things are less likely to be significant burden in the very first place. Like checking history of like checking the background or something like that is they currently do. It is easy to like put in the current procedure. For example, like when the creation of the tariff or something like that. I think since in the current system, those kind of like monitoring or like documentation, something like that did happen, I think it is unlikely to be a things that like detrimental in the burden for the government. But thirdly, but the second thing the CEO claim is about like it is gonna be like EU likely to be short term. They don't care about the long term issue or something like that. I think it's simply untrue. EU also have an incentive to care about long term, because if they don't care about long term and focus on the short term benefits, I think they are literally difficult to learn or like have a better product or something like that. In that situation, the EU is not so much stupid. They are likely to care about the long term issue in the very first place in order to protect their benefit or in order to sustain their country in the very first place. Then moving on to O's case. Two things firstly about the principle coming from OO. OO talked about in the principle, like it is unjust for EU to unilaterally impose the policy outside of the EU. Three responses here. Firstly, as member of government already told you, the environment is a kind of common property. We need some kind of like the person or like the institution who will administrate how environment policy is going to be, or how to protect the environment. Simply because two things. Firstly, those kind of developing country doesn't have a capacity or have an institution to control or like improve the environment or some environment in the very first place. In that situation, like those kind of like those kind of like external factor, for example, EU is necessary to actually help them to better off environment. But secondary is also like there is some kind of collective action problem. If there is no kind of like people who take the initiative, it is difficult for each corporation, each country to actually contribute to like improvement of the environment. In that situation, it is justifiable for the EU to unilaterally impose these kind of like regulation. But secondary, I think that second reason why the principle doesn't work is that logic from OO to explain why it is unjust is because this regulation disproportionately harms developing country. I think it was emphasized by DLO. Then our extension is important because we proved you, rather because of this regulation, situation in developing country will be better off. Farmer can get more like wages, or like farmer can have the can secure their job or something like that. This extension cut the very mechanism from OO to standard principle argument, which means at the moment we prove the benefit for a developing country, OO's principle doesn't work. Then this is why that's why EU need to involve other countries, including developing world. But secondly, about the practical benefits, I think they all explained like small corporations are unable to shift because like they lack of capacity, EU unlikely to support, etc. I think this practical benefit also killed by our extension, that is to say more investment come to a developing world. Then those corporations have incentive to secure land, as MG explained. In that situation, it is reasonable to say that investment will happen to the developing world, which will be benefit the people in the developing world. Very proud to propose.
All right, thank you, Governor.
Okay, so if I'm audible, then my time will begin now. Judge, we agree that the environment deserves protection, just like the government side has always been saying this entire round. However, we strongly disagree that it would take banning all products in the EU market from coming from deforested land to achieve this. Two clashes in this round. The first clash is on the protection of the environment. So firstly, we think that our alternative model also protects the environment, however, with more flexibility, as we do agree that it is better to reduce the amount of products that's coming from deforested land. However, we think that considering the amount of economic benefit it would bring to the developing countries, there's no need to ban 100% of it from going into the EU market. And we think that this is especially important for developing countries on two levels. Firstly, we think that developing countries, they rely largely on agriculture, because in other industries that take lots of like skills, they lack the people to do that. So we think that they rely a lot on agriculture, but also because because in the EU market it's like European countries, and Europe is it has very small land there. So for the agriculture and anything that's related to farming, they largely rely on developing countries, which means that the EU market is extremely important to them. So we think that we do achieve the protection of the environment on our side by still regulating it to some extent. However, we think that it is not necessary to completely ban. However, we also tell you that secondly, what they propose on their side is not applicable, because you just cut down a tree. How do you get so many documents and certificates that tell you when this tree was cut down, or to show that this came from a deforested land? So we feel this is going to lead to low efficiency, and we also think that it's very difficult to tell the difference between wood that was cut down 3 years ago and that was cut down 6 years ago. So we think that this is not the best way of protecting the environment, as it is not exactly feasible at all. But thirdly, through making it clear on our side that the developed countries, they do not get to trade products from deforested land. However, developing countries, they do get to do it to some extent. We're telling the world that developed countries are responsible for loss of the pollution that is happening, that happened through the industrialization, whatever, and they should be more responsible for the pollution in the developing countries. So we are actually holding the right people accountable, which actually sends a message to the developed countries that they should become more sustainable and go green. So on our side, we're actually telling the developed countries that they're the ones who should be more responsible. So we're encouraging them to become more sustainable, therefore protecting the environment. Now, moving on to the second clash, which is talking about the vulnerable stakeholders, e.g. the farmers and also the developing countries. So firstly, the upper half tells you that they're protecting the vulnerable living in outskirts who own this land. However, we think this is directly contradictory, because doesn't this mean that the people profiting from these products that contributed to deforestation are those who are getting less money on their side, because they're the ones who own this land? And if any of the wood or whatever, the stuff on this land, it gets sold, they're the ones who earn the money. And because they're living on the outskirts, obviously that's not a job that they can earn a lot of money from. So they're obviously a vulnerable stakeholder. And so by implementing this policy, they're actually cutting down their income, so putting people into poverty. But also the closing government tells you that farmers are going to get more money. However, firstly, they also contradict themselves in their speech when saying this, because they tell you that most of the farmers, they do not come from EU countries, which are basically European countries, and because the terrain in Europe is mainly hills, and they literally tell you that these farmers, they come from developing countries, and they literally said that they come from countries like Brazil, which are developing countries, which actually supports our argument, because this tells you that they're actually the ones who are harming these vulnerable stakeholders, because they're not letting these farmers actually sell their products into the EU market, which I've explained earlier is one of the biggest market for these farmers. And so we don't understand why the EU would give these farmers money. Like, they do not have any incentives to. They're not, like, they don't have any a common incentive, so, or any common interest. So we don't understand why the EU would give these farmers money. But also, we think that the farmers are getting less money because lots of the products coming from deforested land are from farmers. So this proves to you that they're the ones who are actually harming the vulnerable stakeholders. While on our side, although to some extent we're still harming the environment, but in general, through the regulations we have, we're still offering like more protection than without these policies. But also at the same time, we're not sacrificing any of the benefits of the vulnerable stakeholders. So for some weighing, so we weigh against the general government bench in terms of vulnerability because they're not considering the developing countries at all. They're assuming the developing countries and the developed countries have the same amount of ability to support this policy. However, we think that this is not true for the reasons that I've already explained before. So we're protecting developing countries, their economy, and we think that by the time that they have already developed their economy to some extent and they do not have to rely on agriculture anymore, we think that we can adjust the policies to make sure that they're also protecting the environment. But we also weigh in terms of like feasibility because we tell you that what they're offering you is just not feasible at all. Not only because the developing countries cannot achieve this, but just because in general, like this is going to lead to loss of low efficiency with all these documents and certificates. Like it's just a piece of wood. Like it's very hard to provide like so much evidence. So it's also hard to sell these products on their side. However, we also differentiate from the opening opposition because the opening opposition in their entire speeches are only telling you on how this is a problem, on how it's unfair for the EU to be the one to regulate this. However, we actually tell you how to solve this problem by providing to you an alternative, but also making sure that we fulfill the two main goals in this round, with the first goal, which is also the main goal, which is to protect the environment, but also secondly, at the same time, we also protect these vulnerable stakeholders. Therefore, so proud to negate. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for that speech. That concludes this debate. Thank you everyone for the round. I think me and my panelists